Welcome to the Sleeping Barber Podcast.
This episode's been sponsored by Quadical, fractional marketing leadership using evidence-based marketing practices. That's quadical.com.
Welcome to the Sleeping Barber Podcast, a place for business leaders to get the best and most credible information on marketing, strategy, and innovation. Your hosts, Marc Binkley and Vassilis Douros, share their experiences as they gather insights from the world's leading experts. Now, on with the show.
Well, welcome back to the show. Today we have a very special guest who is a true pioneer in the world of business and marketing. Please join us in welcoming Adam Morgan.
Yay! That was a crowd.
That's just a crowd.
I've never had a crowd on a podcast before. So thank you for the extent of the welcome.
Right? We'll dub in some music, some
like the
clapping
Coliseum there.
Exactly. Fantastic. Are you not entertained? Yeah.
Yeah. Adam is best known for his book, Eat Big Fish, which has inspired countless brands to adapt a challenger mindset and disrupt their industries. He's also written The Pirate Inside, which actually was the original reason I think we reached out at the time to speak about. But then obviously this research became really important. So we kind of pivoted. Right. He's also authored Overthrow, a book prepared in collaboration with PhD. He also hosts a podcast, Let's Make Things More Interesting, which is a podcast I highly recommend. It's been a great addition to my podcast list. So thanks for doing that. But today, Adam's here to discuss the research alongside System1 and Peter Field on the cost of dull, which explores the significant financial impact of uninspired advertising in business. Adam, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, we're very excited to have you here. I just shared your report to, I'm part of the Marketing Association here in Calgary, where I run it. And I just shared it with our community, and I got lots of really great feedback from people here too. So,
oh, great. Well, it's interesting that I think the idea of the cost of dull and there being a specific cost you can put to dull is quite a simple thought, but has really captured people's imagination, and I'm delighted.
Yeah. Funny story at work. I had a fellow coworker or colleague send me the report, and funny story, I'm actually talking to Adam tomorrow morning, which was kind of like a pinch me moment for me. But it's this is great.
Excellent.
So in the ever-evolving marketing and advertising landscape, the concept of the cost of dull has gained some prominence. And I think we've seen that ever since the research came out. So we really wanted to understand some of those hidden expenses that are coming in through these brand assets that are likely more uninspired. But before we go there, I would love for us to kind of touch base and level set on what exactly does the cost of dull really refer to?
The cost of dull looks at how much more you have to spend in media if you are producing a dull piece of communication to have the same commercial effect as if you had produced a more interesting or stimulating piece of conversation, a piece of communication. And the idea is that could we take the data sources available to us and put an exact cost on it, not have a general statement like, you've got no idea how expensive dull is. But actually say, no, it's going to cost you this. And if you do, that's fine. Let's not be judgmental about it. There might be reasons you choose to be dull, because being dull is a choice. Conscious of everyone. There might be reasons your CEO wants you to be dull for some reason. If you want to do that, that's fine. But if you want to have the same commercial impact, let's have a conversation with the CFO and say, I need this much more money. That's fine.
Mm-hmm. When you say dull, I know you use System1 for a lot of the measurement of the rating scale for dull, but is dull the same as boring? I know there's emotional components in there as well.
So we're using, in terms of the data, we're using two different data sources primarily. One is the IPA and one is System1. And we're using clearly proxies in each of them for dull and interesting. So in the IPA data, and the IPA, if your listeners don't know, the Institute of Practitioners in Advertising is a UK database, but it's a very sound, econometrically argued database, which has also parallels, I think, in Canada with the Effies and other kind of markets have a similar kind of thing. And there, Peter Field, who's worked with Les Binet, has obviously been kind of quite influential on marketing effectiveness. He's taken as a proxy, and bear in mind, these are all effective cases. Again, this is quite an optimistic picture. He's taken as proxy for dull marketing campaigns that use rational or information-based ways of trying to persuade the audience. So it's essentially rational information-based stuff, and it's a proxy for more interesting, the kind of more emotional, engaging, or fame-driven kind of campaigns. In the case of System1, one of the things that they measure, again, if your listeners don't know, it's a pre-testing company. They've pre-tested something like 50,000 ads in the UK and 55,000 ads in North America over the last 5 or 6 years, since 2017. And one of the key questions they ask is, at the end of seeing this ad, what emotion did you feel? And it can be negative emotions, disgust, anger, contempt, or positive emotions, happiness and surprise. And in the middle is what they call neutrality. I felt nothing at all. And we're using neutrality as a proxy for dull. It left me, I just didn't feel anything out of it. It didn't move me in any kind of way as a proxy for dull. So in a sense, we're defining it through the databases we've got in that kind of way.
Got you. Thanks.
I have to ask, how did you come about the idea for the research?
Well, I have been in the branding and marketing business for over 40 years now. And one of the things I find myself dismayed by is just the sheer quantity of mediocrity and dullness there is around. I mean, there's a lot of very smart, well-intentioned people. You go to a room full of your colleagues, you don't look around and think, God, these are dull people. You know, God. And furthermore, not only they're dull, they just don't care about the business at all or their business. These are smart, well-intentioned people wanting to produce good stuff. How is it we're producing such a kind of great riptide of dullness around us? And so, and it's not like we don't have the data, right? You know, Field and Burnett, you know, there's lots of data about the impact of great creative work on commercial impact. We know that. We've known it for 15 years now. It's just not having the impact. So I thought, well, what kind of conversation could we have that would have more of an impact? And I was reminded of Daniel Kahneman's observation that the pain of losing something is twice as powerful as the pleasure of gaining it. And I thought, well, can we flip it? Can we make it this about loss aversion rather than, you know, gaining? Because actually that might be a more impactful conversation with the CEO and the CFO as well. So I said to Peter, could you take all your data about, you know, the increased impact of commercial impact, you know, against creativity and turn it upside down and look at actually what it costs to be dull? And his was the first work that we looked at and realized that we were onto something. And then we started collaborating with John and System1, and it's going to run from there. And there's now a whole bunch of other collaborators who are joining us who we'll talk a bit more about later on. And I have to say, I mean, it's interesting because you're sort of chuckling, and I'm the same, but I genuinely don't know whether to laugh or cry about some of the stuff that's coming up, because
that's fair.
Some of it is quite comical, right? And some of it makes you think, oh my God, the waste of talent, the sheer waste of talent and money and energy.
It's funny because anytime you go to like a company conference or something, they're always like, oh, the marketers, they always have fun. They're not, you know, marketing conferences, they always do cool stuff. Then, you're right. We always end up having these ads, or we'll talk more about it, but a lot of the stuff we're producing isn't fun, isn't really entertaining. It's not a reflection of the people we are in general. It's something else.
And I think some of it is because of the little lies we all tell each other, the little lies that, you know, when an agency says, yeah, this is our best work, this is our best recommendation, it often isn't. It's actually all we could do in the time, and we've run out of time, and perhaps you're not paying us enough, so we think this will be fine. And you know, we say, yes, I think this will really stand out in the category, and we sort of pretend to ourselves that the category is how we should be measuring ourselves. And of course, it isn't how we should be measuring ourselves. It's all the other things that are competing for attention. So we do tell ourselves these little lies in meetings that are not beneficial, but I think there's other stuff going on as well.
Yeah, that's a great point.
There's the gauntlet that V and I have talked about this before. The gauntlet of approvals also that might contribute to this, where you just round out ideas and it just shrinks the idea down and down until it becomes like a tiny mole of a molehill compared to this big, bold, audacious thing that it was originally. And is there other reasons?
I think that is I think that is true, but equally there are examples of you know, campaigns that have been approved by, you know, dairy cooperatives, you know, the Tillamook stuff, I think is a really good example. You know, 90 different members of that cooperative approving the work, and yet the work is great and it's been very successful. So it's hard to just point to things like that. I think those can be excuses rather than, you know,
that's a good point.
Are there what kinds of causes have you guys figured out for dullness so far?
So if you start with the fact that the marketing community is full of smart, well-intentioned people, so the question is what's going on with them. So we've got what we're calling the 4 Horsemen of the Dullocalypse. So the four factors that are contributing to this. Because inevitably, listen, we are marketing this idea, right? So we need to make we need to make it engaging and emotionally stimulating. So the 4 Horsemen of the Dullocalypse. So the first is performance, right? So if Peter Field was in the room, he would say, look, over the past, 15 years, performance marketing has really kind of kicked in for all sorts of reasons, partly to do with the channels, partly to do with, the obsession on short-term ROI and short-termism generally. And in performance marketing, of course, where you assume that the audience is already interested in the category and what you've got to sell, it's not as important to be interesting and engaging. And actually, in certain situations, we are really close to the sale. As a purchaser, you just want the information. So there's a performance mindset that's being extended too broadly into brand building. So performance is one of them. The second is optimization, which is, as you look at assets, Vassilis, you were talking about assets. There's a really interesting study, you might have seen it online, by Velvet Shark, where they look at how first tech businesses and then fashion businesses have evolved their logos recently. And you can see what's been going on in that situation is they've thought, this logo's got to be legible across everything from a big 48-sheet poster outside all the way to a little thumbnail. There's too much going on in this logo as it stands. Let's simplify it. We'll use much simpler fonts and that kind of stuff. And it's a very sensible decision to do that, but it means that it ends up being much duller and much more like every other logo that you're doing. So optimization leads to kind of dullness and blandness. Averaging, basically, culturally, you look at averaging and why every Airbnb looks the same, why there is such a thing as Instagram face, why every SUV is the same in terms of sort of the structure. It's just a kind of sense of what used to be called best practice, I suppose, has now become kind of averaging, fueled by the algorithm. So I know we'll come on and talk about AI later on, but fueled by algorithm. So everything is becoming blander and more homogenous in that kind of way. And then finally, I think procurement is a very big issue in the sense that procurement, again, every business should be very concerned with cost discipline, particularly in the current environment. Very sensible thing to do. But when you get to the stage when procurement treats a buying creativity like buying, widgets or nuts or, copper things, that kind of stuff, and doesn't realize actually that creativity isn't like a pop-up toaster. It's not, you can actually say, we'll give you 2 weeks and something will come up and it'll be perfectly brown on all sides. It's not like that. You need to give an agency time to go round and round a few times. And if you don't do that, then they're not going to be able to afford to give their very best recommendation to you. So actually, they are more likely to produce dull work, and therefore actually what should have been a cost saving in procurement actually becomes more expensive to you because dull's very expensive. That's the kind of fourth factor, I think. So, and I'm sure if we were in the pharmaceutical business, we'd say, don't forget regulation. So, there might be other ones in there as well. But I think broadly speaking, you can look at forces like that, again, each of which are quite sensible, apparently in their own right, but have unintended consequences. And one of them, I think, is shaping and influencing the extent of dullness that we're seeing around us.
I think that's a great segue into really kind of almost like opening Pandora's box, if you will, around like the impact and implications. And I think you've alluded to this already, but like obviously dull advertising isn't just an aesthetic issue, right? It's more far-reaching consequences, not only for brands, but for businesses. So I guess my first question here would be, how does dull marketing influence even the consumer perception of a brand?
So great question. Haven't done enough on that yet. There are really interesting examples, aren't there, of, for instance, in the car market, where car manufacturers will test a new model and they'll put 4 different badges on the front in their quantitative tests. And you can see with exactly the same model, you can see the value of each badge. So I imagine there might be very interesting ways of doing that. I'm as interested, I suppose, in the effect that dullness has on a business and a brand of exclusion. So there's a fantastic book called The Examined Life by a psychoanalyst called Stephen Gross, where he talks about the his experience and a number of cases. I think he has something like 15 cases in the book, and each chapter is a case, and he talks about the case and what he's learned from it. And one of the cases is of a man called Graham who's very boring, and he's so boring that Stephen Gross, the psychoanalyst, finds himself being bored while he's actually treating the patient, which is clearly not a good idea. But he realizes, to cut a long story short, that actually Graham is being boring to exclude the world around him. It's a way of managing the world. He wants to exclude the world around him. And I'm really struck that actually dullness is a form of exclusion, and that by being dull, we are excluding the consumer from being able to participate in the benefits of what we have to offer. And particularly, actually, you think about internal comms. So we're talking about advertising. Let's think about internal comms, which is another big, important area of communications within a company, particularly a large company. How much of that is dull? Oh my God! Well, first of all, there's masses of it, right? It pays no respect to the cognitive load that we as employees already have. It just keeps deluging us with stuff, and it's dull. And by being dull, it excludes us from participating in the culture of the company, the messages that are genuinely important versus not important, the skills, the stories, the narratives we might need to successfully navigate our own promotions. So I think that notion of, yes, I think it can clearly decrease the appeal of a brand, and clearly we've got to set in a competitive context, right? So relatively speaking, the energy of another brand that is communicating itself in a more interesting way will be better than ours. But I'm very intrigued by this notion of exclusion, particularly as we look at more and more brands that talk about themselves wanting to democratize X or Y, for instance. And you kind of think, well, you're not going to democratize much if you're making people bored with what you're saying.
It's interesting. I was there's the benchmarking component. Like, everybody feels good by benchmarking against best practices, but in doing so, you end up just becoming this uniform with everyone else. And so there's a sense of security and safety in that, which makes it so that you're not standing out, but also you're not putting your neck out. And so it can't get cut off. And so it's interesting because then you do blend in and become part of the masses without this idea of something unique or something different or something special. It's not what everyone else is doing. So it's
completely agree. Yeah, I was talking to the CMO of a challenger brand in the UK the other day about exactly this thing. And it's a soft drink company, and they need to create new flavors like everybody does. And he said, we deliberately don't. There's two big flavor houses in the world that do everybody's flavors, really. And he said, we don't go to them because they will optimize an average to something that sort of fits the kind of best profile for everybody. We can't do that. We need actually a few people to really like us rather than everybody to quite like us. So breaking the routine, finding ways of not allowing yourself to get sucked into that kind of general averaging and optimization is going to be key for all of us, I think.
And now a short word from our sponsor.
This episode was sponsored by Quadical. Quadical. Did I say that right? Quadical?
You did. Quadical. Yeah.
Quadical. Mark, what is it?
Well, V, I'm glad you asked. Quadical is my own company, actually. So, I'm the Sleeping Barber Podcast co-host with you, but I also have my own company. And so I'm happy to sponsor the Sleeping Barber Podcast, in part because I give so much time to it. But Quadical is a fractional marketing leadership firm where we specialize in evidence-based marketing. And we do consulting work for companies typically between $30 to $300 million, and helping them navigate some of the challenges that people have, like, I know something's broken, but I'm not quite sure how to fix it, nor do I have the time to fix it. And so that's where we help out a lot of people.
Well, I'll speak for Mark as well, because you're wearing your Quadical hat right now. We appreciate your sponsorship of the Sleeping Barber Podcast. And for all of those that may be interested, we do have a whole bunch of sponsorship options. Always looking to bring on new sponsors. We have a lot of creative ideas that can really help across a global audience.
Thanks, V.
No, thank you, Quadical. We appreciate your business.
And now back to the show. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think sometimes we also suffer from, what are the others doing on the other side of the fence, so to speak, where, we even see it across leadership. It's like, oh, look at what so-and-so company is doing. Why can't we do more of that versus, instead of like looking internally, what you could be doing differently. And I think that also contributes to this notion of sameness, because it's like, well, just copy them, just do this, without actually having because it's the perceived notion that, that may be working, because again, it does become somewhat subjective. But I think sometimes even organizations fall in this trap on their own, because they're either following the industry as much as possible, so it creates that sameness. But I like that example of, like, for example, from a flavor perspective, it's like, no, let's have a few people really like us versus the majority quite like us, I think is the way you position it.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Derek Thompson, the US journalist, but he has an observation that the smarter we get in a category, the dumber we get. I got that wrong. The smarter we get in the category, the duller we get.
We love it.
The duller we get. Because his point was, his point was, once every sport understands the Moneyball principle, then actually, everybody's doing the same kind of stuff. But equally, obviously, once Netflix knows what we like, it gives us more of what we like and more of what we like. So actually, our peripheral vision gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Ditto Spotify.
Yeah.
So it's the same kind of thing, right? The smarter we get in a category, the duller we get, and it gets for us is just, again, an unintended consequence. And it's the same kind of thing, which is, let's be really smart and see what the rest of our category is doing and do some more of that. Because again, it's the intelligent thing to do. Just makes us all duller.
So, like, with that idea of the unintended consequence, a big outcome of this report has been on producing a number, a tangible result on what the impact of this dullness has had on marketing budgets. And you alluded to it earlier. Can you talk a little bit about that and what the numbers are that you found and how you came to that?
Yeah, so the first piece of work was, it was Peter looking at the UK market, and I guess the UK market, might be sort of broadly similar, I suppose, to the Canadian market from that point of view. But effectively, he said that if you look at all of their data, and he measures cost in terms of excess share of voice. So the amount of extra media money you'd have to buy to have the same impact. And he said you'd need 7 points excess share of voice to have the same impact with a dull campaign as a more interesting campaign, which amounts to roughly £10 million for an average campaign in the UK. And that's for an average campaign. So that's quite a lot of money. So then with System 1, we looked at what does it cost the US advertising industry or the business, and in terms of wastage. And so they divided all the ads they tested in the 55,000 ads that they tested into 4 quartiles. Top quartile, the most interesting, all the way down to more dullest, effectively, and looked at what the 3 dullest quartiles would have to spend to match the commercial impact of the most interesting of those quartiles. And collectively, they would have had to spend in a typical year $189 billion extra, which is roughly the same as the GDP of Greece. So, you can see that actually the cost of business. There you go, exactly. The cost for so many reasons. So that's interesting.
Yeah, V's Greek, so this is great for him.
Yeah.
For us.
But you said the cost of business, just the cost of business of being dull.
Cost of business
is monumental.
It's a big number. I mean,
that's a big number.
Yeah, it's almost unfathomable to have a number that large. So, put another way, like and that would be for all quartiles. So you've got, as you mentioned, there's really interesting quartile, and then quartile 2 less interesting, then really less dull, and then really dull, kind of, so to speak.
Yeah.
So all those less than cumulatively spend $189 billion more to have the same impact. And
they would have to do the same impact.
Right.
Yeah.
So the less interesting one would be a little bit more than the benchmark, which is the interesting non-dull campaigns, and then more and more as you get further down that scale, right?
Yeah, and you can see that actually in the future, as one starts to play this out some more, you could actually have a gradient, right? So first of all, I think it would be very interesting to say the next bit of work I'm hoping to do with System1 is we take a slice out of the middle of those quartiles. So we say, let's work out what the bar is. So we're trying to work out how our advertising is going to perform. Let's take 6 ads out of the top quartile, 6 ads out of the second, third, fourth, and let's just kind of watch them all and then just assess, basically. So this thing we're thinking of communicating and producing, which bar do we think it jumps over? And then you can almost start to assess, okay, fine, we can tell how expensive that's going to be to support depending on how it performs. So at the moment, we're doing quite black and white numbers, but I think there could be some really interesting tools and frameworks and structures, almost like graphic equalizers, which could start to lead to some very punchy questions about what one does. And indeed, what is risk and responsibility really in this? If people are trying to be kind of responsible by avoiding certain kinds of risks, but actually it turns out that responsibility is leading to your company having to spend much, much more money on the media to have the same impact, it might force us to question what is the responsible and what is the risky thing to do, in fact. It might prompt entirely different kinds of conversations, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, and we think about it like in a time where, for the most part, at least maybe here in Canada or maybe the industry I'm currently in, it feels like there's this notion that budgets are constantly shrinking, and it's not the heydays that it used to be. Having said that, though, this almost feels like there's a big efficiency play here. It's like you invest a little bit more upfront on the creative element, making sure that it is sound, there's an emotional connection, etc. But you end up paying less for the reach later just because of the natural, almost like the content just permeates or lands better with the audience. But sometimes I think we're faced with a challenge, which is like how much the ratio between media investment to production dollars in some of these campaigns, where I think that's where some people may get hung up on, because I know there's supposed to be like almost like a 3-to-1 at minimum, like you want. So for every dollar that goes into production, you want to have at least $2 or $3 that are going into media to drive the reach. What would you suggest is kind of like the recommendation to marketers here on how to do more of that work up front to ensure that you are landing on some sound creative that you can then reap the benefits of later and likely invest less on the media?
Well, I think there's been a huge amount of learning and understanding about, over the last sort of 10, 15 years, about what makes for more impactful communication. So, for instance, we know that emotion and surprise are two of the most powerful tools in communication. But just look at surprise as an example. So, actually, in the kind of the podcast I'm doing, and certainly in the work I and my company do, I'm a partner in a company called eatbigfish who specialize in challenges and working with challenger brands to help them break through. And surprise and challenging the assumptions that people have about a category or about a brand in a category or about the culture in the category is kind of key part of what they do. But I'm amazed, really, given how much we know about surprise and its underlying component, it is about challenging an assumption, how little brands actually seem to do that. It's just not a strategic question that people ask themselves very much. Instead, they seem to leave it all to, we want to do a more emotional thing, and we'll leave that to the creative team to work out how we do that. I just wonder if these conversations need to be more strategic and less purely left up to the advertising agency, perhaps. And if we asked ourselves those more provocative questions, like what do we need to challenge to succeed? What assumptions do we need to overturn? What is the kind of emotion that we want to tap into here, and what are the cues and triggers for doing that with this consumer group? We might just have a shorter path to more impactful work in the way you describe it.
Yeah, and I'm just pulling up, I've got your report on the other screen here, but when we're talking about emotion, you mentioned surprise. Like, I think oftentimes we think of, when we hear emotion, we think we got to make people cry, right? And it's not necessarily that. Like on the System1 ranking, they've got contempt, disgust, anger, fear, sadness, neutral, happiness, surprise. But then there was an example that you guys brought up in the report where there's cows eating for 20 seconds. And that was I think it scored something like a 2.8 on a 5-point scale. And so surprisingly much more emotional than I would have ever thought. That being, so I'm kind of curious, like how, like what do we need to learn about emotion in order to be able to use it better? And is it just that we need to pretest more? Like, how do we take this idea of, we got to make people cry and that, expand our view of that?
Well, it's a great question. So I mean, the cow thing was an experiment, actually. We thought, well, let's try and think of some quite dull things and film 20, 30 seconds of them and put them through the database and see how they perform. And the bit you're talking about is a clip of a cow chewing grass. It's for 30 seconds, actually, but 20, 30, it's the same when a cow's chewing grass. And to see how it performs. And it outperforms 50% of their ads. Now, to your earlier point, Vassilis.
Sorry, can you just say that again?
It outperforms 50% of their database, the cow chewing grass. Oh. Now, of course, it's a cheat, right? Because there's no brand at the end of it. It's just a cow chewing grass. But in terms of the emotional engagement. And to your earlier point, Vassilis, not very expensive, frankly. Not a lot of special effects involved in producing that piece of film.
Yeah.
Locked off camera of cow chewing grass. But it's not a strong emotion. It's quite a benign emotion. But presumably people are feeling a sense of kind of relaxation and pleasure and that kind of stuff. But I think, the question about things like production budgets and constraints, I think, is a really good one. I'm a great believer that, constraints stimulate more and better and breakthrough. So I think that's going to be a very important question for us as we move forward, particularly as there will be competition from AI machines that will be offering to produce creative work very, very cheaply. Mm-hmm. So actually, we as creative producers are going to have to learn how to compete with an entirely different cost base if we really want to do that in that kind of way. So we are going to have to do that. And I think you're right that we are going to have to really understand how to think about accessing and leveraging that range of emotions in a very different kind of way. Well, not in a very different, in a deeper and more useful kind of way. I don't have any useful way of breaking that down or offering more stimulus against that at the moment, other than to say, I think, that there are some very simple levers emotionally which people don't use. So, for instance, character and personality in a brand, we know from all the data, builds distinctivity and emotional connection in the right kind of way. And yet the number of brands we can genuinely point to that have any kind of character or personality are very small. Right? Mm-hmm. So I would imagine that we'd start to see, and one of the reasons we respond to challenges very often is not just that they have a strong point of view, but they have kind of personality that comes through. It's really refreshing for the category, right? They're either much more real and human, or they're these kind of feisty kind of underdogs, or they're these, a bit like Oatly was for a while, this kind of next generation kind of wise ass. So, they have bring these big personalities, and they play the personality as part of the emotional connection, not just the communication itself. So I think we will see emotion starting to pervade much more deliberately broader swathes of the marketing mix again. I hope so, because that, I think, would be a very cost-effective way of doing it. But you've got to be brave, right? Because not everybody likes that. Not everybody wants that. So you've got to go back to that thing about the flavor house. You've got to be prepared to say, okay, I really want to go for, I want to kind of make sure that less people feel neutral about me and more people have some kind of positive response, even if it's a bit more polarizing.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because as you're saying that, I'm like the Geico Gecko, like you would point to something like that maybe as an example, but then if you don't see it in a B2B setting, you go, oh, that's just a weird B2C thing. They do that, but nobody in B2B, no serious business does that, right? And
well, I think that's a great example. Actually, I was talking to a guy called Seth Matlins, another guy who heads up the Forbes CMO network, and he was talking about the US insurance business, and he was saying that, isn't it interesting, sort of, and you could argue that MetLife sort of started off with the Snoopy stuff, but following Geico doing that, what should be one of the dullest categories in the world, which is insurance, in a big, you would have thought, conservative market like the US insurance market, has become this playground of interesting creativity. It's remarkable, really.
State Farm.
Yeah, exactly. People are doing really interesting stuff. So it's sort of triggered because now that's the new bar, right? The new bar is the bar's being completely raised by Geico, and everybody's after doing it. So but we haven't yet. I mean, apart from outliers like MailChimp, we haven't yet really seen that in B2B. Although I do think there are some interesting players in B2B who have challenged assumptions and done quite interesting things that have really broken through. So, for instance, there was a legal firm in the UK for a while, it's still around, called Kennedy's, and part of their sort of central kind of claim was, we want you to use lawyers less. And now we tend to think of lawyers as a bit like consultants, which is, and I say that as a consultant, which is, the rap is they're constantly finding new ways for you to use them, right? Part of my job is to find a new way for you to use, and lawyers are the same. But so for a lawyer to say, we want you to use lawyers less, that's a really interesting role. It's challenging my assumption. You want to say, what does that mean? Well, what it means is we're going to use more AI on the basic tasks, so you'll spend less fees with us. And actually, we're not about sort of the long-term relationship thing in that way. We're about interventions to sort you out. It just creates a different kind of conversation going. So I think there are, pockets of B2B examples of people starting to be more provocative, more interesting, more engaging in that kind of way. But it needs kind of a Geico to kind of set that category emotionally alight, isn't it, really?
What percentage, and I don't remember it, but what percentage of the B2B ads actually fell in the dull category as part of the research?
So in the US, it's 54%, and in the UK, it's 60%. And I can't tell you why there's a difference between the two. I don't believe there's a fundamental difference in the advertising. There's probably a tolerance to mediocre advertising in the US because they're nicer people than us Brits are. Perhaps they're less critical and more charitable all around. I don't know.
How's that compare to B2C?
So B2C is the same in the sense that, so in the US, 47% of ads leave people feeling neutral about them. Sorry, 47% of people feeling neutral is the average response to an ad. And in the UK, 52% is the average response to an ad. So again, the Brits just seem to get a bit more bored more easily with advertising generally. And actually, I mean, System1 does have a global base of 12,000 ads, and we're going to look at that next and just see how that reflects a global picture in that kind of way.
Is there something specific to B2B that's really stood out in the research on maybe what's causing more dullness there?
No, I mean, no, only because we haven't got that far yet. So, I mean, I think we're very much at stage one. I'm really interested in B2B. For all the obvious reasons. Huge market, seems to be huge potential there. It's of course more complicated because there are different kinds of B2B, aren't there? I was talking to somebody the other day who said we've got two different kinds of B2B clients. We've got people we've got a brand who is selling websites to small businesses. They're just like B2C, really. It's the same kind of thing. Whereas conversely, we've got a sort of quite a complicated kind of software consultancy where it's all, it's the end-to-end relationship. That is completely different from B2C. So we're thinking about how do you really explore this in a nuanced enough way in B2B to get an accurate picture. And that's just a big piece of work we probably need to get some sponsorship for and dive into. But it would be fascinating. I think pharma is a really good example of this, which is pharma is a category producing life-changing drugs. So this is surely a category where being dull and excluding people from participating in these life-changing drugs is an awful thing to do. And yet they would say we've got regulators, we've got a very conservative, approval process. We've got corporate affairs who are terrified of overselling and that kind of stuff. So there's lots to be done within individual categories, I think, that would be very important. But we haven't got that far yet.
Yeah. I don't know, we talked about, V and I talked about this one once, but I used to be in pharma, and Ozempic. I don't know if it's just in Canada, but they had a really interesting ad that we talked about one time.
Ozempic.
Just because there's so many distinctive brand assets, but you can't say anything in Canada when it comes to pharma. And they literally don't, other than just talk to your doctor. But there's these O's all over the place, and the colors and the distinctive assets, and there's like people that are doing very fun, exciting things all over. So it's interesting because even in that scenario, like I totally get it. There's a lot of companies that would go, we're not going to do anything. And then there's this example where you're like, how come they can do something like that?
Yeah. That is
nobody else is.
And how did it work? Do you know? I mean, clearly you noticed it and you talked about it, but I mean, do you have any idea about how it worked?
I as far as I know, we did a bit of a case study on it. I can't recall the numbers off the top of my head, but I know it's flying off the shelf. I know it's doing really well. There's a lot of, it kind of fits into the, like, I take a pill and fix my diet issues kind of category and weight loss. So I think it's in that.
It's hard to divorce one from the other. Yeah. Do you know what's the actual product story? Yeah.
But it was an interesting example for sure. What, from your perspective, like, is there, this is from what I can recall, this is like partially a trend going back to what you talked about at the beginning, this rise of performance marketing since say 2012. I always use that because Facebook went public. But there's this like trend, and I think it was going down in terms of brand spend, but in heavily shifting towards performance marketing. Are there trends that you're seeing where you're seeing a reverse in terms of people's interest in investments in brand and fame? Well,
I think this year that spend on Meta is going to overtake spend on TV, just on that one channel. So I think if you look at the way the money is going, it is going in one direction rather than back again. I don't know enough about kind of global TV spends. I do know, I suppose, obviously that the prediction that TV is dead has been made for quite a long time, and it isn't the case at all. And actually, as we all know, in terms of effectiveness, it's very much alive and kicking and well. I do think, though, that the work that people like Dr. Karen Nelson-Field are doing, we're looking at when somebody promises you reach, what are you really getting for that? How much attention are people really giving you? Because it's probably a fraction of a second. And particularly the work that she's doing around talking about how much attention do you need to either reinforce an existing memory structure or build a memory structure is leading people to question their media choices in a way that is questioning that trend, if not reversing it. So I do think there are some very interesting elements that might help with that. But whether they are strong enough to resist that financial appeal of, the apparently greater reach for apparently less money is a good question.
I wanted to shift gears a little bit and start thinking about talking a little bit about the creativity and the solutions, because we can appreciate that the antidote to dullness is creativity. However, I think you talked about this earlier on, Adam, and I just want to double click into it a little bit, is, risk aversion. Do you believe fundamentally that is probably what's still stifling creativity across industries, and maybe why the sameness still exists?
Well, so first of all, just picking up the first part of what you've just said is, I think, yes, it is creativity. That's a part of it. It's also, though, dull inputs. So there's a creative over here, Vicky Ross, who said, dull inputs lead to dull outputs. So I think dull strategy leads to dull work, and that actually it's responsible for us. The responsibility of the strategic side, both sides of the client and the agency, to produce more interesting strategies rather than just to produce something that is directionally right but very dull and leave it up to the creative team to sort it. So I do think there's a strategic responsibility to make stuff more interesting as well as a creative one. So I would spread the load a bit more around that, and I think there are some kinds of questions we might want to ask ourselves strategically, which we're not asking ourselves at the moment, and build into our strategic processes that would get to more interesting outputs that the creative team could then take and make more interesting. But in your point of view about risk aversion, clearly there are kind of two levels of this, right? So there is a whole bunch of clients who are terrified of social media blowback and public blowback because they read the Bud Light case history and they've seen what happens when people stick their necks out. And I think there's clearly an educational program that says look at Geico. Geico's been very creative without any blowback whatsoever. You don't have to stick your neck out on a social cause necessarily in order to be creative. That isn't necessarily what being brave creatively means. It might be, but it doesn't have to be. So I think helping people understand what is risky and what is not risky is valuable. Yeah. But also I go back to this thing about what is risk and what is responsibility. There's a really interesting piece of film produced by a bunch called the Creative Circle in the UK in the 1970s, and it's called Risk and Responsibility. And it's 4 creative directors of London agencies talking to camera about what is a risky and what is a responsible decision in choosing your advertising. And they role play the presentation of that famous old Ogilvy ad, the man in the Hathaway shirt. You remember? Picture of a man with a patch over his eye in the shirt. And 2 of them role play the creators, and 2 of them role play the clients. And so they present the man in the Hathaway shirt as it kind of ran, and the client says, "Absolutely fantastic! Love this! Love this! Love this! Great! 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 Let's go with it." Just a couple of questions. So the first is, that's not the only shirt we produce. And we have other patterns. Can we put some of the other patterns down the side? And so, very sensible question. The agency responds very responsibly and says, "Yes, of course. Well, that's more down the side." They present it back again, and then one of the clients says, "Yeah, just one thing. Man in the Hathaway shirt. Where's the customer benefit in that?" And they go, "Oh, I don't know." So they change the line to something else, and then come back and the eye patch. Eye patch is a bit unsavory. Who knows what's behind it? Has he got a saw? Is there weeping behind his eye? Can we take that off? Anyway, so they have this, very well-intentioned thing, and they end up with just a dog's dinner of an ad. It looks nothing like the kind of thing at the end. And they make the point about where was the risk and where was the responsibility in each of those conversations, really. What seemed to be the responsible question to ask by the client and the responsible response from the client, from the agency, in fact, turned out to be the riskiest thing that they could both do together. In the same way, I think that we need to have a more grown-up, modern conversation about what is risk and responsibility. Because I think people are smart, well-intentioned people, think that they are protecting their businesses from risk by making certain kinds of decisions. And in fact, they're not. They are exposing them to greater risk through dullness, through all sorts of other things. And hopefully what we're doing with the cost of dull is part of that conversation about risk and responsibility. But in a sense, we need to have a massive kind of collective intervention and a collective sense of how do we have this conversation together, all of us, right? Because it's in everybody's interest. The agency wants to produce better work, and it also, frankly, wants to have more impactful campaigns on its reel. And the client obviously wants to have the commercial impact, and they want to get promoted and that kind of stuff. It's in all our interest to have a different conversation about risk and responsibility.
Welcome to an intervention.
Yeah,
exactly. There you go.
We only have a few minutes left, but I was wondering, we brushed over AI before, and I wonder, I could see how AI could lead you down a path of I guess giving away the responsibility of, it does it, it's optimizing, and all those 4 horsemen thing probably fit into that category of AI. But I wonder if there's opportunities that are and so there's risk in terms of leveraging AI. And I wonder about your thoughts on that, but also bright spots about where this might be able to be useful in terms of content production.
Yeah, so I'm really intrigued by this because if you look at, there's a guy called Carl Chaco who wrote a book called Filter World, which you might have read, where he's talking about the effect of the algorithm effectively on around us and that averaging that we talked about earlier on. And he says, well, look, AI and the algorithm is a force of, in his words, compounding sameness. I like compounding sameness. Because effectively, it'll take everything that's out there, it'll wrap it up and present it to us again. And so that's what we'll produce. And you can bet your bottom dollar that somebody is out there offering AI machines that are going to create content for clients, and that'll be very cost effective. And initially a client will say, I'll just try it for a small bunch of what I'm doing, and increasingly it'll spread and take larger and larger share, argue a bit like some of the digital channels have done. And so there will be this greater homogenization. Now that said, if a 30-second clip of a cow chewing grass can beat half the ads, you might say, actually, overall, AI will raise the quality of what we're doing in terms of it'll take out that bottom 1.5 quartiles, right? It'll just take out that stuff. It'll say that's no good. So I think actually maybe the overall standard will come up slightly in the sense that we'll get less awful stuff, but that actually we won't get that really top quartile in the same kind of way. The challenge will be, I think, as I say, is that is around the constraints of production budget when you can compare one to the other. So I think the creative business will have to reinvent itself somehow in ways yet to be defined, but we'll see. And I think I'm really intrigued by how I think certain creative businesses are reinventing kind of what's possible. So there's an agency called Uncommon that's got the British Airways business that's just produced the latest safety video for British Airways that they've released onto YouTube that's got 1 million views on YouTube. These aren't even people strapped into a plane watching a safety video. So there's a venue for something in a completely different way, not as a TV ad or any other kind of communication that actually is building the relationship with the brand. And by the way, talking about Britishness in a very fresh and interesting way. So I think there's going to be a need for a more lateral reinvention of the possibility of communication that will have to complement AI being used for the nuts and bolts of it.
Yeah, it'll be interesting when we start crossing that threshold where there's going to be more risks in relying too heavily on AI. Because now I feel like we're going to be in a similar position where performance marketing became the synonymous with just marketing and just the way you do marketing now, where now you have a lot of companies going back in the other direction, relying back more on the brand stories and leaning on brand more. I feel like we're getting into that generation of AI. Everyone's getting really excited about it, going to start using it more and more, but we may swing too far on the one side, and then there'll be a notion of trying to bring things back. So I think that's going to be one of the biggest risks, because I think it's the cost of entry into these AI engines is a lot lower than these big production houses. So naturally, in this time of efficiency, companies are going to look towards that and be like, well, it can reduce, it's not 100%, reduce our costs. We're able to still generate engaging content. It may rate well. It'll be interesting how that whole space evolves over time, though. Yeah,
there was a tweet the other day, about 6 months ago in the UK, by a company called Klarna, and Klarna is a payments company, and the CMO was saying, we're using AI. We've halved the size of our marketing department because we're using AI, and so we're focusing on the much higher quality stuff, and we're having a lot more fun. And you thought, okay, well, that's a interesting sign of the times. But also, at what point does somebody say, okay, well, let's halve it again and see what happens? I mean, how many? In 8 years' time, is it just 2 people doing it, and the rest is AI? I mean, that seems like a kind of one-way valve to me, but we'll see.
Yeah.
Adam, how can people find out more about you and the future reports that you might be coming out with and all the work you're doing?
Yeah, so my company's got eatbigfish, so eatbigfish.com, and indeed our research, which is the Challenger Project, challengerproject.com. We'll be sharing that information as we go, and we're doing more work. We'll do more sort of drops, as it were, in October and then in next February, along with System1, along with Peter Field and the IPA and other collaborators. So hopefully it'll be quite easy to find if you follow us.
Yeah.
Oh, and do listen to the podcast. Let's make this more interesting. It would be lovely.
I love that.
It is great. Podcast. I really,
Oh, thank you. Well, good. Just recording season 2 at the moment, so we'll see.
Awesome.
Amazing.
Go ahead, V.
I was just going to say, thanks again, Adam. This was great. Really appreciate all the work that you're doing, and can't wait to see the evolution of this study. I think it's going to inform a lot of great marketing moving forward. So we appreciate your work behind it.
I love the conversation. Thank you for having me on.
Our pleasure. If you like this show, please leave a review. And even if you didn't, we'd love to make this show better, and your feedback will help us do that. Like, one thing that I think it was you that was asking this question, and I was like, oh, that's a good question. But it was kind of like, no, it was really good. No, come on. But there's a question, I think it was, I think the idea of it was like, we look at things of doing benchmarking to an average. and you go, look, this is what all the competitors are doing. And so we'll do that. Like in, let's say, B2B, a lot of times like SaaS products come to mind. Let's show the environment of which people work in, and show our product in that. So a guy with a clipboard in a warehouse, let's say, with a scanner doing that kind of thing. And, and our product serves those people. We need to put those kinds of ads in. And so everybody does that. And so you end up in this position where you're benchmarking against an average.
Yeah.
And the average is really generally pretty
low.
And so then, like, I think it was you that asked this question, where it was something like, well, are you putting your company at a higher risk for just doing the same thing that everyone else is doing? Because most of the time that's ignored. Yeah. Which I thought was a great question.
But like, if we think about it, it's, I don't know, Matt. Like, we look at our shared experiences, and then, you know, obviously a lot of the work that you're doing right now, the stuff that I'm subjected to, always looking over the fence, always. You know, what is a competitor doing? And I mean, I think that's what detracts and maybe what doesn't incentivize marketers as much as when you're being asked to just look across the street. What's happening on the other lemonade stand there? How are they promoting? Yeah. And it sucks the creativity out of the discipline in some capacity. Not in some capacity. Like, it actually just sucks it out completely. So it's like, well, if this is all you're looking for, here we go. Yeah. But how are we differentiating ourselves?
Insert stock image here.
Exactly. Well, maybe AI can do this. We have something we can share with it and say, hey, I want you to create something like this.
Totally.
Right. And I think that becomes extremely difficult environment to operate in, because again, it's, you're not allowing yourself to be truly creative.
Yeah. Yeah. And it is interesting because you've got, I like the way that Adam framed it too, because there was that conversation he had at the beginning, or part of the beginning of the conversation, I should say, is why they chose to do the cost of Dull. And it was it was the fear of loss. Yeah. So they could have framed it as, we need to be more interesting, but the fear of loss is a more powerful motivator, which I think is really a smart idea, because you've got this idea, coming back to your question, like, well, if we just do the same thing that everyone else is doing, there's a legitimate chance of us just burning cash. And then we have to spend that much more to make our creative work the same as if we just invested a little bit more in creative, not even necessarily invested, just put more time into it. Yeah. To thinking about how to deliver it. It might actually cost the same as producing a Dull ad.
Totally.
But it's just that process of trying to achieve something more stimulating than the average.
You know, it's funny because like the biggest aha moment for me was when he outlined what I think was the 4 things that cause Dull ads. The first one was 4
Horsemen of the Dullocalypse.
The 4 Horsemen of the Dullocalypse or whatever. Anyways, I can't word today.
Did you just say I can't word today?
I can't word today.
So good.
Was performance. So it's essentially that obsession with short-termism, performance marketing, if you want to really take it back. The second is the subtle optimizations, again, really tied to that performance marketing side. The notion of averaging. Yeah. Like everything's just an average. Yeah. And then procurement. And he made this comment which made me laugh. Is like, creativity is not a pop-up toaster. I'm like, that's fair. You can't just go ask for it and there it is. Bing. Right? Yeah. You have to nurture it. You have to have the right platforms. You have to have all these other things in place to allow for this creativity to happen. True. Sequentially over time and consistently. And when I think about those 4 things, of course that you have this sea of sameness. How many people are investing, I don't know, call it 40 to 50% of their budget on performance marketing? Not saying you shouldn't, right? Yeah. But how many companies are doing that? The majority are doing that.
Or probably even more.
Optimizations. Think about how many publishers are coming to these enterprises and saying, you need to be spending X on your branded keywords. You need to be doing these optimizations on these tactics. Yeah. So everyone's hearing the same thing. Yeah. what are you creating?
Yeah, and part of, a lot of these conversations that we've had recently are just kind of mixing together in a way. Because as you're saying that, I'm thinking about like, I wish I could remember where I heard this. I think it was on Fergus O'Carroll's podcast about optimizing to outputs,
right?
Versus optimizing for indicators.
Yeah.
And so and it's kind of related to Colin Powell's conversation that we had about that, why does a drunk look for his keys under the lamplight? Well, it's because that's where the light is. That's where the light shines. And the same idea with data, like Google, Facebook, Meta, TikTok, all of them are producing data. So we look there.
Yeah.
But those are the indicators for the platforms.
Yeah.
They aren't the outputs that the business is looking for. So then we end up spending so much of our time looking at these indicators on the platforms and not necessarily at the outcomes for the business.
Totally.
And measuring a impact against that instead of these, where the light shines idea of platforms.
Yeah.
So then everybody's doing that and everybody starts optimizing towards those where the light's shining.
Yeah. Like ding, ding, ding. Like it just starts making sense. Like how we got here. Yeah, man, it's crazy. What else did I have here? Obviously, he talked about, similar to what Ella had, if you remember when we were talking to her about her. Jesus, really, I can't today. Oh my God.
It's okay.
Yeah, I can do this. This.
I believe in you. You're smart enough. You're strong enough. Gosh, other people like you.
Anyways, okay. Emotion and surprise are useful and creative. We've seen that time and time again. We've seen that coming out of even like System1.
Yeah.
I have a note here saying, not a strategic question, should not just lean on the agency.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, again, this goes back to, it's very easy to say, well, I hired this really fancy agency for these creative ideas and we're spending money on them. Like they should just be able to do this for us.
Yeah.
I'm sure they're pumping out ideas. Your ability to either be risk averse or not take it as a way to, because it doesn't, maybe looks different than what you're comfortable with.
Yeah.
I think it comes back to this internally, how you're actually receiving these ideas.
Yeah.
And then obviously constraints stimulate creativity, which I can get that.
Yeah. I do think that's one of the things you just talked about is that I keep coming back to this Better Briefs project where they talk about how people who write briefs think they're amazing at it. Like 90% of people that write briefs think they're awesome at it. And then you ask their agency partners, they go,
they
not so much. 10% agree.
10% agree.
It's a big gap. And I think some of that has to do with just the clarity of the strategy, which in some cases isn't necessary. It's an extension of the business strategy. So
that's true.
We're coming into Q4 and there's going to be a lot of people going through strategic planning sessions.
Yeah.
And I just rewatched Roger Martin's A Plan Is Not a Strategy. And there's so much stuff about strategy in general that is convoluted. It's full of marketing gobbledygook or business gobbledygook.
Yeah.
Jargon and buzzwords and all that kind of stuff. And there's not a clear diagnosis of what the challenge is.
Yeah.
And so then you end up with a laundry list of things to do, and that's ends up in these creative briefs, which then comes up into the agency, and then the agency's like, what do I do with this? And so they try and fit all this stuff into a spot of some kind. And then it kind of, the process just washes out, and then you go through the gauntlet of approvals, and I can see how this all kind of relate. Like, it starts from a root cause of probably oftentimes poor strategy.
Poor strategy, but like I've also seen the reverse is a business can be so dynamic in the moment where something may happen and you're trying to pivot because you're getting ready to invest a boatload of money into some of these campaigns.
Yeah.
But who knows? Something happened in the industry itself where now you've been asked to pivot. So any work that happened, and I think this is where the absence of true strategy, right, gets in the way of sometimes something like, because technically, if you're trying your strategy as an organization, like I want to increase my market share or my market penetration by X points. And so marketing is taking that back. Okay, how are we going to do that? Here's the plan. You build a brand platform. You have some, campaigns that you want to build towards. That should always be consistent. Like that shouldn't change. Like whatever you're putting out in the market should be in service of that. Only when, though, a business may say, and this is where it's that short-termism comes in. It's like, we're struggling this quarter to meet profits. We need to cut budget, or we need to rethink our strategy because our competitor now went out with a different message.
Right.
That's where you run into problem.
Right. Because then to your point before, you're like, oh, look at that over the fence there. What are they doing over there? Yeah. Look. Oh, we should do that. That's cool.
We need a red shoe.
Yeah. But even to your point about, we need to increase market share by X points. Like, that's not a strategy. That's a wish.
Oh, totally.
Like it could be X, Y, or Z points. Who knows?
Yeah.
But if there's not a clear definition on, well, how are we going to do that? Like the diagnosis part.
That's why I love Rogers
and that's agreed upon by everybody. Then it makes it really hard. And then almost anything could fit. And then especially that's when you're influenced by, well, what are they doing? What are they doing? And so instead of what are we going to do?
That's why I love Rogers' framework.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where it's such an easy framework to follow that if your organization can align on it and say, this is it. That's how you can build, what is that 3, 5, 7 year view? And then again, we were talking about it with James, even most recently, with James Herman, was you build that consistency through a platform and like you know what you're doing, right? Like it doesn't have to change materially. And I think that's where, again, a lot of organizations, even at the enterprise level, get stuck. And it's hard to stick to one plan and kind of stay with it long time because we maybe perceive you're not being agile. You're not reacting to the moment. You're not reacting to the market.
You're fucking genius, Pete.
Whoa. I'll take it on this Friday
even though
morning.
You can't word today.
I can't word today, but I'll take it.
Because that's a good point. I remember also there's a thing about Mark Ritson had said about 2-speed marketing. And this is kind of speaks to the 595 rule, but also like performance and brand and all that and bothism. Because you can have two almost operating systems. One is the short-term performance marketing. That's the stuff that you maybe are looking over the fence. What kind of offer they're offering? What kind of discount? What product they're featuring? All that kind of stuff. That's like your competitive intelligence and competitive, reactionary, agile speed. Yeah. There's also the other speed, which is reaching the 95% of customers who are not in market today, knowing that they're not in market today, but they might be in the next 6, 12, 18, 24 months, however long that might be.
Sure.
Where it's a slower speed. You're less focused on reaction and more focused on what are we doing? Because you need that speed to build over time. And the more you change that, the less memory building you're doing.
That's a great point. My only caveat or my only push there is, in times of budget cuts, which of the two budgets usually gets cut?
It should be both.
It should be both, but usually what happens is like the slower burn stuff. So then again, you're back into this like reactive, not memory building. Yeah. You're sending, 5 emails in the same day to your email list. You're really kind of forcing the transaction as much as possible. And then even if you look at it from a tactic perspective, you're just leaning on those remarketing. Yeah. Are you ready yet? How about now? Remember this product that you viewed on our website? I'm going to chase you until you're blue in the face.
Buy.
Buy now. Urgency. You need a better CTA.
Yeah.
Anyways.
But even at that though, like this is where I say cut both, because that buy now thing, you're going to people who predominantly know you.
Yeah.
But if you need to get growth, like the people who know you are smaller percent of the population that could buy you. So you do need some amount of broader reach tactic.
You know what's this is very actually it's very timely, because right now going through this exercise where we've had to go through some budget cuts and things to that effect, which unfortunately has led us to remove a lot of our consideration and awareness tactics from the market. Mm-hmm. So we're really leaning on some of those high conversion tactics to kind of see us through. So we have this graph that we follow where you have your orders over site traffic, right? Okay. And the orders is just a line graph, and then the traffic is the bar graph. And what we're seeing right now is while our traffic or our orders are somewhat flat, like they're very stable, there's a big delta between our our order volume and our traffic. Our traffic is down, and it's showing like a really big decline. And on the one hand, you can say, oh my goodness, you're converting at 2% right now. Chapeau, what are you doing tactically? It's like, well, shit, I only got search running, for example. And of course it's going to look really good because that's where a lot of intent is being shown. But we know there's going to be a point of diminishing return where we don't have enough new traffic visitors coming to the website to offset and drive more interest.
Right.
So it was literally a couple of days ago, we're having this conversation, and I was asked by one of our leaders, well, when do you think that point of diminishing return is going to hit? And I calculated kind of a formula to be like, well, when do we think that would happen? And it really is like, we don't have more than 3 weeks. Where now we're going to start seeing our conversions start dropping, because we had a couple campaigns that created this incredible halo effect. Budget cuts came in. You're focusing on conversion-based tactics. It's that point right now where it's like we have, and it's a natural lull going into October as well. Before your Black Friday, Cyber Mondays. It's crazy.
This is the thing with, I think, the performance focus. You end up almost like yo-yoing because you just see the thing in front of you instead of trying to create stability and predictability. You're just reactioning.
I love that.
Reactioning. So you're like constantly yo-yoing and like, oh my God, we're up. We're winning forever. Oh my God, we're down. Oh my God, we're gonna lose forever. And so then you're just constantly reacting to those ups and down swings. I mean, maybe that is what Agile is about, but that sounds also insane.
It is insane, and
thinking that would change if you're constantly reacting that way.
Exactly. Yeah. Anyways, it's
fascinating.
Yeah, fascinating stuff.
Yeah, all that because of dull.
That's right. Don't be dull, people.
But I don't mean that. I mean your results. I just mean all of this conversation.
Wait, did you say I'm dull? Is that what you just said? Just kidding.
No, that was fascinating. Anyway, I do think embracing risk. You did mention this. I just want to point this out. Embracing risk is actually, with more creative ads, you mentioned, is a way to create more efficiency with your media buy. I think that's really smart.
What is risk? What is a responsible decision? I don't remember. Sometimes I don't even understand my own notes. But I know Adam really wanted to emphasize a point about, making sure that you are taking those risks, because that's where, that's where a lot of, unique ideas can really come to fruition.
Yeah. It's liberating too, because the idea of like, we shouldn't take a risk because nobody else is doing it. Well, nobody else is also doing things very well most of the time.
Yeah.
And so that's a risk. Like, it's not an either or trade-off. Like, you're risking one way or the other.
Yeah.
So there's a thing there. Yeah. I think it's fascinating. It's a really interesting conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, thanks,
Thank
Adam.
you. Yeah, I was just going to say, thanks, Adam. Great conversation. Really appreciate you having on. And by the way, I think he also said he'd be more than willing to coming back on the podcast. Just saying.
Wow. Yeah.
Look at us.
Yeah. Yeah. We're going to start mapping out our lineup next year. It's going to be great.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so.
Okay, buddy.
And with that,
yes.
on this rainy Friday morning here in Calgary,
raining?
Alberta. Oh, yeah. You haven't seen outside, eh?
No, I'm sitting in my basement. It always looks the same.
Sea of sameness.
My basement office is very dull. Although I am enjoying my fake bamboo tree.
I mean, it brings out the colors in your eyes, my friend.
Thanks.
But yeah, I'm going to go try to pick some profitability myself.
Oh.
Actually, it's raining profits right now. That's even a better thing. It's raining profits. Just go and bask in all the rain, not the profits.
Don't get hypothermia.
Yeah, please avoid that.
Okay, buddy. We'll talk to you again soon.
Sounds good, man. Have a great day.